Good evening all and welcome to day 2 of Nature Week. Tonight we're going to be heading into the middle of nowhere for a truly chilling collection of scary stories. But for now, it's time to get comfortable, and I'd like to wish a very happy birthday to Logan. So get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I was 15 at the time. I live in the south in a town that was built along the Natchez Trace. For anyone who doesn't know, the Natchez Trace is a very long stretch of road that runs almost the entire length of the United States north to south. It was used by tribes way back when to quickly get around the country for trade, and during the Civil War, it was used by both Union and Confederate soldiers for travel. It is federally protected land now and is very isolated. No one is allowed to build anything within about a mile of the trail, and there are almost no streetlights, a simple 2-lane road. There are burial mounds, even unnamed Civil War graves, and lots of offshoot hiking trails. It is extremely illegal to dig up anything. In my town, it isn't uncommon to go hiking out there because it's absolutely gorgeous. But there were stories about being careful. I remember in the 90s a young woman was killed out there while hiking, and there were all sorts of bogeyman stories about not being out on the trail after dark. Hiking the trail was something that me and some friends used to do a lot when we were young. We used to go off-trail often, because you can find some really cool stuff back there. One day, me and my buddy were out there going through some trails and checking stuff out like we always did. It was in the spring, and not quite summer yet, but the days were starting to get longer. It wasn't super late, but later than usual, than we were usually out. It was barely dusk. We were about an hour or two into hiking, and had gone off the trail like usual. We come upon this break in the trees that opens up into this big open field, and there's an old truck out there. That alone was a huge red flag, because you can't use any vehicles off-road there. But there were 2 dudes next to the truck, with shovels and enough dirt next to them that you could tell they'd been digging a pretty hole for a while. The bed of the truck was open, but we couldn't see inside from where we were. They looked at us, and there was like this weird second or two when no one said anything, and I don't remember who moved first, but I remember both dudes just jumped into the truck, started it up, and drove full speed towards us. We ran back into the trees in a panic, because we thought for sure they were going to run us down. I remember hearing the truck stop at the trees behind us as we ran, and hearing them get out and yelling. We ran for what felt like a solid few minutes before we jumped into a deadfall of broken trees, and stayed as quiet as we could. We could hear them a way off, and could hear dogs barking as well, like they had dogs with them. And I can specifically remember hearing one of them yell at one point, "I can't see you, but I can hear you, and my dog's gonna get ya." We just stayed quiet and didn't move, because we never heard them get close enough that we thought they'd spot us. Eventually we heard the truck start again in the distance, and stayed out until we couldn't hear it anymore, and then we carefully walked back to the car without saying a word. I remember the ride home. We were quiet, and every pair of headlights we saw made us almost have a heart attack, because we assumed it was them who were looking for us. I never did find out what they were doing out there, but it must have been something bad. When I was younger, my brain always went to the obvious cliché like someone hiding a body, mostly because it would be a good spot to do. No one looks for stuff out there. But as I got older, I began to think it was probably either dirty money or drug stashes. The town is also small enough that I've always wondered if I ever ran into these people again out in public and just not known it, getting groceries or running errands. How many times have I been a car or two behind them at a stoplight? And to this day, it gives me the willies. In the year of 1974, when I was 11, myself and a friend were walking back home from the River Waveney near Barnby in Suffolk, UK. We lived in Barnby, a small rural village. This area is countryside, and there were very few people around, and we took a shortcut next to the railway line and on a bridle path, a wooded area, and we then saw a clearing next to the rail line, but near the clearing smoke come out of a chimney. We both said that it was a bonfire ahead and kept walking. As we approached, we saw a white wooden Victorian-looking house with a smoking chimney, 2 children playing, a boy and a girl, and an older woman on the porch. All the women were wearing long Victorian-style dresses, and a man in a cloth cap chopping wood on the ground about 5 meters in front of the property. We leant on the wooden fence and observed the family and house for what seemed like a few minutes. I clearly remember saying and agreeing that no one lived here and that I'd never seen that house before, as we had used the bridle path previously. The children saw us and started to come towards us. The man chopping wood said to keep away, and I remember the woman looking at us. The man then walked towards us holding the axe, but not aggressively, and asked us to go away. We then became frightened and ran back the way we came, avoiding the woods, and terrified nonetheless. We ran about a mile to the village shop, and told the lady who ran it about it. She said no one lives next to the rail line except the railway cottage, but that it's not in the clearing, and some way away from our sighting or experience. We told our parents and they didn't believe us either. As time passed, we weren't believed. We just avoided the bridle path, but we both know what we saw. 51 years have passed, and it still sticks in my mind. Believe it or not, but I know what happened. I'm sharing this because I'm curious if anyone else has had a similar experience. I wasn't alone when this happened. There were 2 other people in the truck with me, and they both saw the same thing. So in December of 2022, I drove to Fresno to pick up a car I had bought. I'm from the Monterey Bay area, and normally I would take the northern route, but for some reason I went south instead. We left around 8 p.m. I drove the whole way and wasn't tired. If anything, I was focused and looking forward to getting there since I was picking up the car the next morning. While about 3/4 of the way along Highway 145, something caught my attention off the side of the road. At first I eased off the gas because I thought it was a dog, and as I looked more directly at it, I realized it didn't look right. It was moving on all 4s, but it didn't have a solid shape. It looked translucent, darker than the surroundings but not fully defined, almost like a shadow. The closest comparison I could make is that it resembled a monkey in how it moved, but it didn't look like any animal I've ever seen. It started up on a small hill beside the road and ran diagonally down towards us, then matched the speed of the truck. It kept pace alongside us for several seconds before cutting across the road in front of us. That's when I hit the brakes. It didn't come to a full stop, but I slowed down significantly and kept rolling forwards. After a few seconds, I looked at my passenger Maria and asked if she had seen it. Both she and her husband Daniel said yes. I asked if what we saw was real, and they both immediately said no. We were shaken, but we didn't really have a choice except to keep going. We were already close to our destination, and stopping out there didn't feel like a good option. About 30 miles later, something else happened. My GPS suddenly went completely black. Now I knew I was supposed to stay on the highway, so I kept going, assuming it would come back on at some point. And it did. And when it did, immediately it rerouted me and told me to turn onto a smaller road off the highway. I remember thinking it was strange, but I assumed it must be redirecting us around something, so I followed it. I turned onto the road and drove for about a mile. It was darker and more isolated than the highway, with very little around. Up ahead, under a single streetlight, I can see what looked like a van stopped in the middle of the road. It resembled a utility van. I slowed down and asked Maria if it looked like there was enough space to go around it, but she said that from this distance she couldn't say. As we got closer, I had a strong feeling that we should keep going. I can't point to anything specific that caused it, but it was just enough that I didn't want to continue forward. Between that and what happened earlier on the highway, I decided to turn around. I drove back on Highway 145, got back on, and continued the rest of the drive without any other issues. Later, I tried to look back at the route in my Google Map history to figure out exactly where that road was, but the entire trip was missing. My location history goes years back, but that specific drive isn't there at all. I know I made the trip because I picked up the car and brought it home, but there's no record of it. I've tried to come up with explanations for what we saw and what happened with the GPS, but I don't have a clear answer, and the fact that the three of us saw exactly the same thing is what stands out to me the most. My great aunt had just passed away, and I was able to take time off to attend her funeral. My husband and I were driving from Colorado down to northeast Texas. We planned to go through Kansas and Oklahoma, which seemed straightforward enough at the time. The drive started going wrong not long after we got on the interstate outside the city. Our car battery suddenly died while we were already on the road. Even with the battery failing, the car alarm started going off and wouldn't stop. We managed to get off the road and replace the battery, but the alarm kept blaring even after that. It continued while we were driving non-stop, until we finally pulled a fuse to disable it somewhere in Kansas. After that, things settled for a while. We avoided using the toll roads through Kansas and only stopped for lunch. Nothing else stood out until we reached Tulsa. While driving through the area, the interior light in the car turned on and would not switch off. We tried everything we could think of, but nothing worked. Eventually, we had to pull another fuse just to stop them from staying on. By the time we got onto the toll roads heading forwards towards Texas, it was around 9:30 at night and fully dark. We hadn't realized ahead of time that the tolls in that part of Oklahoma were cash only. We were able to get through the first one by stopping at a gas station and breaking a $20 bill into smaller cash. We made it through a few tolls like that, but eventually ran out of cash. At the next toll booth, we didn't have enough to pay, and the attendant told us we would need to take a detour of about 20 miles to find a place to get more. She also gave us a notice and explained that if we didn't pay at the next toll, we could be flagged and state troopers might stop us. We followed the detour she gave us, but when we reached the gas station, it had already been closed for over an hour. There was nowhere else nearby to get cash. Around the same time, the car started having trouble again. It would stall after starting unless we immediately pressed the gas. Once we realized that, we could keep it running, but that made everything more stressful. With no clear way to get cash, and not wanting to risk another toll booth, we decided to try taking back roads that ran alongside the toll roads. These were unpaved and uneven, and it was difficult to drive on them with the condition the car was in already. We were looking for a specific turn onto a road called Jumbo Road. When we finally saw the sign, it didn't look official. It was painted on what looked to be a piece of poster board, and the paint was streaked and uneven, like it hadn't even set properly or been affected by the humidity. But we turned onto the road anyway, and as we drove, we started noticing animal eyes reflecting in the headlights from all sides of the road. Otherwise, it was quiet. When we reached the first bend, a dog ran out into the road in front of us. I slowed down, and instead of moving away, it came alongside the car and started snapping at the tire. I sped up to get past it. Not long after that, another dog appeared. This one was larger, tall enough that its head was near the level of the windows, and it ran alongside the car, barking and chasing us for a short distance before falling behind. At that point, the whole situation felt off. We were on an unfamiliar dirt road late at night, with a car barely holding together, and nothing around us except scattered properties we couldn't really see clearly. We stayed on that road until it eventually led us back towards the interstate. Once we got back onto a main road and crossed into Texas, we were about an hour away from the hotel my mum had booked for us. Well, around 1 a.m., a thick fog rolled in. It reduced visibility to the point where we could barely see the road ahead, especially on the smaller winding highway we were on at that point. We had several close calls with other vehicles before finally making it to the hotel around 1:30. By the time we got there, it felt like we had been dealing with one problem after another the entire trip. Nothing about it seemed connected at the time, but it was one of the more stressful drives I've had. When I was around 17, two friends of mine and I decided to camp out in a field next to my housing estate. It wasn't an official campsite, just a large, grassy field on a slight hill that was far enough away from the nearest houses that we could drink, play music, and not really worry about it bothering anyone. You couldn't really see the spot we chose unless you were already pretty close to it, so it did feel quite private. We set up a small tent, brought some drinks, and stayed out there into the night. Eventually my two friends, Chris and Jake, fell asleep. I, however, was having trouble sleeping, so I lay there awake, listening to the quiet and trying to relax. At some point, probably around 3 a.m., I heard movement outside the tent. It was the sound of grass and vegetation being stepped on, very distinct and close by. What stood out was that I hadn't heard anyone approach us from a distance. It was just suddenly there, like whoever it was had appeared right next to us. My first thought was that it could be the farmer who owned the land. That alone made me tense, because, strictly speaking, we weren't supposed to be there. But there was something about how sudden it was that made me feel worse than just getting caught. I stayed completely still and tried to slow my breathing so I wouldn't make any noise. A few seconds later, I heard a second set of sounds that I'm almost certain was a dog moving around. The steps were lighter and irregular, circling more than the person did. Whatever it was started walking back and forth around the tent. The footsteps were steady, and they stayed close, never really moving away. I didn't hear any talking, no commands to the dog, nothing that would normally come with someone out there walking at that time. It was just the sound of movement. At one point, I noticed a shadow passing over the tent fabric. The shape was large and clearly human, stretching across the side of the tent as the person moved. It looked bigger than I expected, which made it harder to ignore. What made it stranger was that even though I could hear the dog moving around us, I never saw a second shadow that matched it. This went on for several minutes. It's hard to say exactly how long, but it felt longer because I was focused on every sound. Eventually the shadow stopped appearing, and the footsteps became quieter. It didn't sound like the person walked away in a clear direction. It was more like the movement just faded, as if the steps were getting lighter rather than more distant. After a while, when I was sure it had stopped, I leaned over and quietly tried to wake Chris and Jake. I told them what I had heard, and that we should probably leave in case someone had found us. They didn't take it seriously. They assumed I had been half asleep and imagined it, and neither of them wanted to get up and pack everything in the middle of the night. After a bit of back and forth, they went back to sleep. I stayed awake, knowing I wasn't going to fall asleep after that. About 10 minutes later, the sounds came back. It was almost like someone slowly turning up the volume. The same footsteps, the same pacing around the tent, and again what sounded like a dog moving with them. I whispered Chris's name again, and this time he was already awake. He told me quietly to open the tent so we could see who it was. I moved as carefully as I could, reached for the zipper slowly so I wouldn't make noise. It took longer than it should have because I didn't want to draw attention if someone really was standing right outside. When I finally unzipped it, I pulled it open quickly, but there was no one there. Both of my friends got up immediately, and we stepped outside the tent. Because of where we were on top of a hill in an open field, we had a clear view in every direction. If someone had been there and tried to leave, we would have seen them. There was nothing. No person, no dog, no movement anywhere. I know how it sounds, and I understand why my friends thought I might have imagined it the first time. But the second time they heard it too. Even now, I'm sure there were footsteps outside that tent. I just don't have an explanation for who or what was making them. This happened a few years ago, around 2013, when I was visiting my Uncle Dave, who lived in a very rural part of northern Colorado. The area had been around since the early 1800s, and there were still a lot of old dirt roads and older sites nearby, including a cemetery with graves from that time period. At the time, my cousins Ethan, Luke, and Ryan and I had gotten into the habit of going out at night to explore different spots in the area. A lot of it started with the idea of ghost hunting, even though none of us were taking it very seriously at first. There was one abandoned house we had gone to where we thought we heard a voice clearly say, "Get out," and someone claimed to see something in the doorway. But we didn't let that stop us. We kept going back out on the weekends, checking different locations. The strangest thing that happened took place one night, when all of us, along with my uncle, were driving around. It was late, must have been around 2 a.m, and we were on a dirt road about 15 minutes from the nearest town. We came up to a small bridge with what looked like a fast-moving river running underneath it. On one side of the bridge there was a large grain field that stretched out towards a small patch of forest in the distance, probably about half a mile away. There was a narrow dirt path leading from the road into the field in that direction. We decided to stop for a few minutes and get out. We stood near the bridge, watching the water and talking. Nothing unusual happened at first. After a while, we started heading back towards the van. And that's when we noticed a light in the middle of the grain field. It was small, orange, and it looked like it was moving. At first, it was kind of just bobbing up and down slowly, coming in our direction. The area was completely isolated with no house or buildings nearby, so the first thought was that it might be someone out on the land, maybe coming over to see what we were doing there. When we got back into the van and started to slowly drive away while keeping an eye on it, as we watched it more closely, the shape stood out. It looked almost square, like a lantern, and it didn't seem attached to a person. It didn't seem to be coming from any fixed point. It just appeared to be moving through the field on its own. As we picked up speed, the light did the same. It went from moving slowly to covering ground much faster, easily keeping pace as we drove down the road. At that point, we were all paying attention to it, trying to figure out what we were looking at. Then, about a quarter mile away from the bridge, the van suddenly shut off. It wasn't just the engine. All the electronics cut out at the same time. The headlights went dark, and we were all left rolling forward in silence. We could still see the light in the field behind us, still moving in our direction. My uncle managed to get the van started again after a few seconds, and as soon as it came back on, we accelerated and left the area. About a week later, we decided to go back during the day to look at that spot again. We drove to the same bridge and got out to take a closer look at everything. What stood out immediately was the river. Where we had seen fast-moving water the week before, there was now a dry channel. It looked like a narrow path, where a river might have been at some point, but there was no water at all. The ground looked dry enough that it didn't seem like it had just recently disappeared. It looked like it had been that way for a long time. We didn't have an explanation for that, but after looking around for a bit, we decided to come back that night and see if anything else happened. We returned around 1 a.m. The area felt different than before, even before anything happened, and we parked the car near the same spot and sat in the van for a minute before getting out. Ethan and I decided to walk down the dirt path that ran alongside the grain field, heading in the direction of where we had seen the light the week before. while the others stayed near the van. We had been walking for a few minutes, talking to just keep things casual, when we heard my uncle calling out to us. His tone was urgent. He was telling us to come back. So we turned around and started walking back towards the van. We were probably a little over a quarter of a mile away at that point, and a few seconds later, we heard a loud sound coming from the direction of the forest. It's hard to describe exactly. It wasn't like an animal or anything mechanical. It was more like a deep, drawn-out roar, but not something I had heard before in real life. As soon as we heard it, we both started running. We didn't stop until we reached the van and got inside. After a few minutes, once we had calmed down a bit, we told everyone what we heard. My uncle then told us that the reason he called us back was because he had seen 3 lights shoot up into the sky above where we'd been walking. We didn't stay much longer after that. We got back into the van and started heading home. On the way back, we were talking about everything that had happened when we passed something on the side of the road. We didn't get a good look at first, so we turned around and went back. It was a car, flipped upside down on the side of the dirt road. The windows were shattered, but aside from that, the car didn't look as damaged as you would expect. There wasn't another vehicle nearby, and there were no clear signs of what had caused the crash. We got out to check if anyone was in there, but there was no one around and it was completely empty. There was a purse still inside, which made it seem like whoever had been in the crash hadn't left with their belongings. We looked around the area for a few minutes, but we couldn't find anyone. Being that far out with no one else around, it didn't make sense where the driver could have gone, and we ended up calling the police to report it and then continued back to the house. That night, after everything, I had trouble sleeping. I was lying in the living room, and through the window, I could see the outside lights turning on and off intermittently, and I stayed awake until it got light out. Looking back on it, I've tried to piece together what might have happened. There were probably explanations for parts of it on its own, the lights, the car, the sounds, but taken together, it's harder to come to a clear conclusion. But what do you all think? This happened when I was around 8 years old, so at least 11 years ago now. My family and I were on holiday in Spain, staying at a large resort not far from Barcelona. The place was huge, especially the sports area. There were multiple soccer fields, basketball courts, rugby pitches, all spread out over a big open space and surrounded by tall fencing. During the day, it was always busy, with people playing everywhere, but at night, they closed off the whole area. One evening, I stayed out later than I should have with a friend. I don't remember his name, I think it was Brian, and we were on one of the soccer fields, just taking turns shooting penalties and not really paying attention to the time. Well, at some point, the staff locked up the perimeter, but because of how large the area was, we didn't notice it happening. We only realized when we tried to leave and found the gates locked. At first, we just stood there trying to figure out what to do. It was already dark, and without the daytime activity, the whole place felt completely different. There were no lights on in the field, and the size of the area made it feel empty. We didn't want to get in trouble, so instead of calling for help, we decided to follow the fence and look for a way out. We walked along the perimeter for about 20 minutes before we found a gap. It wasn't an official exit, a hole in the fence, and on the other side was a patch of forest. We hesitated for a bit, but since it was right next to the resort, we assumed it couldn't be that big and decided to go through. At first it seemed manageable. The ground was uneven, and it was darker than expected, but we kept moving in the direction we thought would lead us back towards the resort entrance. After about 5 minutes, we came into a clearing with an old concrete structure, and it looked abandoned and was partially covered in graffiti. We tried to give it as much space as possible, but as we passed, we heard the sound of glass shifting inside like bottles being moved. We both stopped at the same time. That's when a man came out the structure and looked directly at us. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there staring. His clothes were torn, and he looked like he hadn't taken care of himself in a long time. His hair and beard were long and unkempt, and he had a noticeable limp. He coughed, and that seemed to wake someone else inside. A second man came out, and the two of them started talking to us in Spanish. We didn't understand what they were saying, but the tone wasn't friendly, and we began backing away slowly. When they saw that, they moved towards us faster. Within seconds, they broke into a run, shouting and throwing things in our direction, and we turned and ran. The forest was dark enough that we could barely see where we were going. We just kept moving forward, trying not to trip, while listening to them behind us. It felt like it went on for much longer than it probably did, but eventually we reached the edge of the forest and came out onto a road. The road ran along a steep drop on one side, and there were no houses or people around. We kept running uphill, putting as much distance as we could between us and them. Eventually the road ended at a large property with a gate and a house set back from it. There were no lights on. We didn't stop to think much about it. We climbed over the gate and ran into the yard and then hid in a cluster of dense bushes. Not long after, the two men followed us onto the property. They were making enough noise that it woke someone inside the house. A man came outside shouting and looking around. He was holding a gun. He walked through the yard close enough to where we were hiding that we could see him clearly, but he didn't notice us. When he saw the two men, he fired a shot in the air, and one of them kept moving towards him, and he reacted immediately, forcing both of them back and out of the yard at gunpoint. Once they were gone, everything went quiet again. We stayed there for a while trying to make sure it was safe, and after about half an hour we climbed back over the gate and left the property. The road was empty. We headed downhill this time and eventually reached a small town. It had been hours at this point since we left the resort, and that's when everything really started to sink in. After walking for a bit, we saw a house with people inside and rang the doorbell to ask for directions. There was a language barrier, but we managed to say the name of the resort, and they pointed us in the right direction. We followed the road they indicated, staying close to the house this time. Along the way, we passed what turned out to be an abandoned slaughterhouse near the resort. We heard people speaking Dutch nearby, and went to ask them how to get back. Inside, the place was still covered in old blood. It was on the floors, the walls, even parts of the equipment, and there were knives left behind too. It wasn't something we expected to walk into, so we didn't stay long. The people we found gave us directions, and from there it was only a few minutes back. When we got there, the staff didn't let us in right away because they didn't recognize us. We had to explain which unit our parents were staying in so they could confirm it. By the time I got back, everything had gone back to normal. There were still pancakes left, and I ended up playing Pokemon with my brother like nothing had happened. The next day, my mum gave me some money for the arcade, and later my bike got stolen. It sounds strange looking back, but that night in the forest was easily the most dangerous situation I have ever been in my life. My fiancé and I love hiking. We've had some strange moments on the trails before, but nothing like what happened a few weeks ago. We went for a short hike at a state park that we've been to dozens of times. Since it was a quick trip before dinner, we didn't pack our usual things. No knives or pepper spray. I even said it would be fine, we've done this plenty of times. The first half was normal. The woods were quiet, and then we came around a bend and saw a woman standing off to the side crying softly, almost like she wasn't aware anyone else was there. A few feet ahead of her was a man with his back turned, pushing a stroller down a rocky trail, where a stroller made absolutely no sense whatsoever. We kept walking, trying not to stare, and about 5 minutes later, we decided to turn back because we were starving. On our way back, we saw the man again still pushing the stroller. I glanced inside out of curiosity and it was empty. No baby or blanket, simply an empty stroller being shoved through the woods. Without thinking, I whispered to my fiancé, "There's no baby in there." I thought we were far enough away that he wouldn't hear me, but we weren't. My fiancé looked over his shoulder, and a moment later he said to me quietly, "He's staring at us." I didn't look back. I didn't have to. I could feel it, the weight of his stare. Then came the sound of the footsteps behind us as the man was picking up speed. We began to walk faster, and he sped up too. Every time we looked back, he was still there, not close enough to reach us, but always visible and always watching. We passed the crying woman, and she didn't even look up. The stroller was gone now, and the man in his blue hoodie was walking quickly behind us, and that's when we ran. My chest was tight. I could barely breathe, but every time I glanced back, I saw flashes of blue moving through the trees. The trail had sharp turns, and each time we rounded one, we'd lose sight of him for a second. Then he was there again, still walking, still following, and finally, after what felt like forever, we caught up with another group of hikers ahead. As soon as we did, he was gone, vanished into the woods. We sprinted into the parking lot, jumped in the car, and tore out of there. The whole drive home I kept second-guessing myself. What if there really was a baby? What if he just wanted to confront us? But deep down I knew something was seriously wrong. I haven't gone back to that entrance since. Sometimes I hike from different parts of the park, but lately I've noticed baby clothes scattered along the trails. Little socks, a onesie, and every time that same cold feeling crawls up my spine. I grew up in the Sonoran Desert, and most of my childhood was spent outside with very little supervision. My parents would tell me to be back by dinner, and not worry much about where I went in between. A lot of that time that meant wandering miles into the desert with a few friends, exploring whatever we came across. There were always strange things out there. Some of it is just part of growing up in a remote area. People do things they shouldn't. You'd find abandoned structures, as well as animals acting unpredictably. Other times it felt harder to explain, but I've always tried to keep a practical mindset about most of it. One of the more memorable things we found happened when I was probably around 11 years old. A group of us had gone a few miles into the foothills near where we lived. That wasn't unusual for us. We spent a lot of time out there, and by that point, we were used to coming across random debris, old equipment, or the remains of structures that had been left behind. That day, we came across what looked like a manhole cover set in the ground, with a short concrete shaft around it. It didn't look like part of a road or anything official. It was just sitting out there by itself. We were curious, so we tried to open it. One of us had a piece of rebar we'd been carrying around, and we used that to pry the cover open. It took a bit of effort, but eventually it gave way. Underneath, there was a vertical shaft with a metal ladder leading down. I'd guess it was about 20 feet deep. We didn't hesitate much at the time, and decided to go down and see what was there. At the bottom, it opened into a small underground room. The walls were cinder blocks, and one side was covered in what looked like a grid of writing attached to the wall. Even at that age, it was obvious it had been built for some kind of utility purpose. Looking back now, it was probably something like a telephone or electrical wiring switching room. What stood out more was that it didn't look abandoned in a way that other places seemed to be. It looked like someone had been using it. There were water jugs scattered around along with a few sleeping bags. The walls had drawings and symbols on them, including things like pentagram and swastikas done in marker or spray paint. There were also stacks of magazines and other items that didn't belong in a place like that, especially considering how far out it was. At the time, we didn't stay long. The combination of being underground, clearly used by someone, and the things on the walls made it feel off enough that we decided to leave pretty quickly. Later on, thinking back on it, there were a few possible explanations. There were abandoned ranches and buildings scattered throughout that area, and it wasn't unusual for local teenagers to find places like that and use them as hangouts. It could have been something like that, just taken a step further by being underground. At the same time, The area we were in was also part of a route people used to move through the desert towards the city. It's possible it had been used as a temporary shelter or stopping point at some point. Either way, it wasn't something we went back to. We had already seen enough out there to know when something wasn't worth exploring further, and that happened to be one of those times. I've always liked caving, to the point where I eventually joined a club that organised trips and sent out monthly packets with different tours. Most of them were pretty standard, including what they called Wild Man tours. I've done a few of these before, and while they were more involved than regular guided walks, they were usually manageable, some climbing, maybe a bit of rappelling, but nothing extreme. One month, they sent out information for a much longer Wild Man tour, something like 7 to 8 hours. It was described as more technical and physically demanding than the others. The packet made it clear that there were real risks involved, including narrow passages where you could get stuck if you took the wrong line, and sections where a slip could mean falling into a deep drop. It also mentioned that rescues in that kind of environment were difficult, and they could take a long time. I signed up anyway. The group ended up being small, 3 guides, myself, and one other participant called Alex. From the beginning, it felt different from the shorter tours I had done before. The pace was slower, and the guides felt more deliberate about where we placed our hands and feet. Some of the sections required careful movement along uneven rock, and there were areas where the path narrowed enough that you'd have to think about how you were positioning your body. About halfway through the trip, we stopped to rest on a narrow ledge. It wasn't wide, and it sat right next to a significant drop that disappeared into darkness. You couldn't see the bottom with your headlamp, which made it clear just how deep it was. While we were resting, one of the guides, called Mark, mentioned that with larger groups, they sometimes did a total darkness demonstration. It was something I had experienced before in other caves, where everyone turns off their headlamp to get a sense of how completely dark it is underground. He asked if we wanted to try it. Since there were only 2 of us on the tour, it felt safe enough, so we agreed, and we turned off all the lights. The darkness was immediate and complete. There's no adjustment period like that, like there is at night. Once the light is gone, there's nothing to see at all. You can't make out shapes or movement, just a solid absence of light. And we stood there for maybe 30 seconds when we heard a sound. At first it resembled footsteps somewhere in the cave, not close to us, but not distant either. It was followed by what sounded like loose rock shifting or falling. Then there was a sound that was harder to describe, like something sharp, drawn out, a screeching that echoed through the space. The head guy turned his light back on immediately, and when the beam came on, I could see his expression clearly. He looked genuinely concerned. His first reaction seemed to be that someone might have slipped or fallen off the ledge. He quickly checked that both Alex and I were still there, then turned to the other 2 guides and asked if they had heard it. They had. None of us could explain it. None of us had moved. He radioed up to the surface to ask if any other groups were in the cave system, or if anyone had gone missing based on where we were, but that didn't seem likely. We were several hours into the route, and without the proper lighting and experience, it would have been extremely difficult for anyone else to reach that area. We waited there for a few minutes while he listened for a response and watched the surrounding area, but nothing else happened. There were no additional sounds, and the cave went back to being completely quiet. After a short discussion, the guides gave us the option to stop the tour and head back, saying that we would understand and refund it if we weren't comfortable continuing. After talking it over briefly, we decided to keep going. The rest of the trip was uneventful, with no other sounds or anything out of the ordinary. I've tried to come up with explanations for what we heard. It could have been rocks moving somewhere deeper in the cave, or sound carrying in a way that made it seem closer or more defined than it actually was. But the sequence of it and what sounded like footsteps followed by falling rocks and that screech hasn't matched anything I've ever experienced before, and by the sounds of it, none of the guides either. It's the only time I've been underground. that I've heard something that I immediately can't make sense of. My grandparents were retired and living in southern Idaho, just outside of Pocatello. Their place sat out in farmland, a few acres of open fields around it. The neighbouring properties had milk cows and horses, and down by the river bottom you could sometimes see whooping cranes. There weren't many trees except for an old apple orchard near their house. Interstate 15 ran through that area, not very far from where they lived in fact. It didn't get a lot of traffic, especially compared to the bigger stretches of highway, but what stood out about that part of the road was the terrain. There were old lava fields nearby, made up of these large black boulders of lava rock. The rock was extremely sharp, not something you'd want to come into contact with at high speed. When they built the freeway, they had cleared a lot of that rock away, but not all of it. Some of the larger pieces had been left in the median between the northbound and southbound lanes. They weren't small rocks by any means. They were jagged, uneven formations that would do serious damage in a crash. Well, one time while I was visiting my mother, she brought it up when we were talking about driving through the area. She told me to be careful on that stretch of road more seriously than usual. I remember responding that I already drove carefully enough and didn't plan on running off-road, and bear in mind this was before cell phones were a distraction while driving, so the concern felt a bit overemphasized at the time. She didn't drop it. She said there had been multiple accidents along that stretch where drivers crashed on their own, with no other vehicles involved and no witnesses. According to her, a lot of those crashes didn't end well, especially when the cars went into the lava rock in the median. Then she shared a cautionary tale about one person who had survived one of those crashes. According to what she'd heard, he said he swerved because he saw a figure standing in the median, someone on horseback wearing what he described as a full feathered headdress, and the sight of it startled him enough that he reacted and lost control of the vehicle. I asked if she meant someone in a costume trying to make sense of it in a practical way. She said no, and that people around there believed it was a ghost. I didn't have much of a response to that. It sounded like a story that gets passed around the rural areas, especially given the history tied to the land. But I do remember the way she said it, like it wasn't just a story. Since then, whenever I've driven through the area, I've thought about what she said. Not that I expect to see anything. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed these stories. I'm sorry if I sounded a bit off in today's video. Honestly, I have what some people call vocal fatigue, throat fatigue. So yeah, my voice box is it's not doing great right now. I think I'm not breathing enough or something during the recordings. But I will make an effort to try and rest my voice because I want to push through with Nature Week. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed today's video. I'd like to extend an extra special thank you to my members and patrons whose names can be seen on screen for their continued support and contributions to help keep the channel running. It really does mean a hell of a lot, so thank you everyone. And I will be back tomorrow for, I think, cabin stories. It's going to be good. And if you want some cabin stories now, if you go over to Spotify or Apple Podcasts, you can find the podcast there. Mort's Bedtime Stories, by the way. Don't know if you guys knew. We're on episode 92 now. Gosh, it's been going a while. Anyway, speak to you guys in a bit. Have a good one, and good night.